wasn't actually a new scenario. It'd been happening for a while. In fact, it goes all the way back to the beginning. See, back then at the beginning, the setting was different. Amongst the tree-lined paths of a great garden. A garden with more shades of green, more types of plant, more shapes of fruit than any botanist of today could begin to imagine. It was there, alongside the rivers that sprung up from the ground, amidst a breeze that felt like it came from beyond the garden, from beyond the earth itself, there, at the foot of a single tree, that it first happened. It's not like they hadn't been warned, they had. God himself had warned them because he loved them. The moment you take from that tree, you're dead. But, well, they saw the fruit, the one he had warned them about, hanging from the tree he had warned them about, and they felt something they hadn't really felt before. See, even though he had told them that they had everything they needed without it, even though he had crowned them as the rulers over the full garden, even though they could eat of any fruit from the sprawling, lush foliage, they saw this one, the one they couldn't have, and it was pleasing to their eyes, and they took it for themselves. This was the first time, but it was only the beginning. Because like a pebble on the freeway that bounces up and hits a windshield, bringing a webbed shattering that covers the entire thing, this moment of impact spread across all humanity. This desire to decide for ourselves what looks good, and in spite of God's instructions and warnings that it will lead to pain and brokenness and death, we reach out and we take what we want for ourselves. We do it to our world, and we do it to one another. Unconcerned about the pain, the brokenness, the death we may bring to the people around us. People like a woman named Bathsheba. Bathsheba was a woman in a culture where women were certainly not treated as equals. They were more like goods to be traded among men. But she had found a good one. A man named Uriah, and he was like the tough military type from a kingdom with a history and a reputation of having an incredible military, full of strength. And he was honorable, too. He was committed to his comrades who he had left home with to go off to war in service of his king, while Bathsheba remained at home. And so it was one day while at home, a normal day, like any other day, Bathsheba decided to take a bath. And bathing was a little less frequent then than it is now because of scarcity of water, but it wasn't uncommon. But little did she know that this bath was different, because someone was watching her from afar. Someone who knew he shouldn't be looking at her. He saw this woman, and he saw something to take. This was no ordinary man. This was the king. The same king that Bathsheba's husband was putting his life on the line to serve. The same king that God chose to lead his people. The same king God instructed to be a shepherd for the people, to care for them, to protect them. A king named David. David, a man who supposedly represented the best of God's people. This king, who even though he had everything he needed in his wealth and power and resources, who though he had been crowned by God as the ruler over Israel, even though he could meet and marry any single woman he wanted in the entire kingdom, and he already had, by the way, he was married already, he saw this one, the one he couldn't have because she was married, and she was pleasing to his eyes, and so he decided to take for himself. So he sees her, he decides he wants her, and he demands that she be brought to him. She can't possibly say no. David is in this position of power over her that makes consent impossible. And this was not like the world we're in today where people can decide whether or not to do or follow what a leader has said. In this time and culture, you obeyed every word of what a king or queen told you to do without question. We know that's what's happening because even at the beginning of this passage, it just casually says, it was around that time of war that kings send their armies to go out to war, that time of the year. The kings could just be like, it's wartime, go fight some wars for me. See, feedback was not welcome or even considered. And David, a man who's supposed to be a shepherd, who has a reputation for being a kind and caring king, he summons Bathsheba. You wonder if, when Bathsheba was summoned, if she had any idea what she was even being summoned for. This is a situation where consent was not possible. Matter of fact, let's talk for just a second about consent. It's kind of awkward, I know, but it's important for us to just highlight this for a minute. Consent is giving someone permission. I would guess that for a lot of you, you probably are told or taught about consent at school or maybe somewhere else. But at Menlo Students, we believe that the foundation for how we interact with anyone in any situation or relationship begins with the reality that every person is made by God in his image. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before, the image of God, but I don't know if you realize what it really means. See, to be made in the image of God means that God crafted and made you and me and every other person in this world with precision and care and love and intentionality and passion and excellence. And that because of that, within each of us, there's this beauty and capability for love and grace and justice and kindness and creativity and every good thing humans are capable of. See, a Christian understanding of humanity is that all of those things, all of the very best parts of us, come from God. It's that because God gave us life and made us in his image, every single person, no matter how positively or negatively we may view them, has dignity by design. God created them that way, and no human has the right to take that from any other human. You can see how this understanding of human value could be a foundation or like a compass for how we interact with our fellow image bearers, right? And here's one of the coolest parts about this understanding of human dignity and value. It means that you and I have actually been empowered to be people who honor the image of God in one another. And one of the ways we do that is through consent. That's because God even chooses to act this way with us. Think about it for a sec. God doesn't force us to comply with his good will or the good plan that he has for our lives. We choose to accept him or not. We choose to trust him or not, or to follow him or not. So if God builds this concept of consent even into how he relates to us, how much more should it apply to the interactions that we have with one another? And so that means seeking consent isn't a chore. It's not something that we ask for because we have to do it to appease our culture or something like that. Consent is a gift. It's a way of us being able to embrace the image of God within ourselves to honor the image of God within others. And it's not just about sexual or romantic things. It's about honoring and respecting the boundaries of our fellow image bearers in all of life. So practically, that means anytime you're going to interact with someone else's body or their property or their reputation, you should ask. You want to borrow a friend's jacket? You see they got this cool vest on, you want to borrow it? Ask for permission first. You want to give someone a hug? That's great. You should ask for consent. In doing so, you're enabling the other person to choose to receive the love that you want to give. Now, as we said earlier, unequal power dynamics, where one person has a level of power over another that other person doesn't have, those dynamics mean consent cannot be freely given. So for example, if a teacher requested that a student participate in some sort of inappropriate physical act, there could not be consent, because the student may worry about what would happen if they said no. Or, for example, if there's this king who happens to be watching a woman bathe without her knowledge and then summons that woman to sleep with him in his chambers, she might worry that if she said no, he could imprison or kill her or her family or do something horrible. This story we're reading today is not one of consent. It's not a story of someone asking, but of someone taking. It's a story of sexual assault. Consent is a way that you and I see people, not for what we can take from them, but for who they are as a creation of God, beloved by him. Consent is a way that you and I honor the dignity that others have as fellow humans and images of God. And we read that David saw Bathsheba bathing. But what's clear is that while David may have looked at her, he actually didn't see her, right? Like not as someone with dignity, as a child of God. Bathsheba was looked at, but she was entirely unseen. David saw something he thought looked good, just like those humans back in the garden, and he reached out and he took. And when he's done with her, he discards her. He just sends her back home to be alone. But just as was true for Adam and Eve hundreds of years before, when you and I decide what's good in our own sight and we take for ourselves, it only brings pain and brokenness and death. And David has brought those things to Bathsheba because Bathsheba is pregnant. And with just a few little details, it's made clear there's only one possible father, and it's David, the abuser. So David panics. He gives instructions for Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, to come home from war. And when he comes home, David wines and dines him and tries to get him to sleep with Bathsheba so he can cover it up and make it seem like it's their kid. But Uriah, in the starkest possible contrast to David, Uriah's honorable. He says, "Why should I get to have a night at home in my warm house, being all cozy with my wife when my comrades are out fighting and sleeping in tents? I couldn't possibly do that to them." So David sends him back to war with a letter for one of the generals to pick a fight with a nearby army and send Uriah out into the battlefield by himself to die. And he does, and Uriah is murdered. And then David marries Bathsheba, and the baby is born but then dies 7 days later because of the pain and brokenness and death that David has brought into this family through his assault. And this is where Bathsheba's story begins to fade. A bit later down the road, she becomes pregnant again, and David promises that the kid will be the next king, and then we hardly hear another word from Bathsheba for the rest of the Bible. We read about how God brings justice and judgment on David and how as a result of David's actions, really the entire nation of Israel is set up for hundreds of years of division and fighting over the throne and pain and brokenness and death. But Bathsheba just sort of fades into the background, unseen. For about 1,000 years, there's almost nothing until there's this little baby born to a teenage girl, and Bathsheba is mentioned in his genealogy. You know, I think for a lot of us, we often wonder how we can trust that God is present and working in our lives when in the moment it doesn't feel like he's doing anything. We feel unseen. But friends, one of the ways we know God is engaged and is up to something is by looking back at all of the ways he's been engaged and been moving before the moment we're in. In our lives, in the lives of others, and in the lives of people in the Bible, we look to see what he's done before, because the reality is, if you can trace the hand of God in your past, you can trust the hand of God in your present. See, if you're anything like me, you want stories to have immediate resolution and justice, right? Like, I want the villain captured at the end. I want the victim to rise up and become a hero. And sometimes that happens, and it's so rad. But sometimes it takes a lot of time to see what God's up to. Like in the lives and stories of Bathsheba and a lot of the women we've talked about up to this point, we see that in God's story, there's actually a truth below the surface, which with every woman is kind of more and more starting to bubble up to the top. There's this passage in the book of Romans in the New Testament where we read that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. In all things. Did you hear that? All things. That means if it's not good, God's not done. If it's not good, God is not done. That's actually one of the primary overarching themes of the whole Bible. And it's one of the overarching themes of the lives of the mothers of God, that there may be pain and brokenness and evil and death in your life right now, but God is not finished yet. This is God's promise to those he loves, that God is bringing all things together for good, that he is working, he is moving, he does see you, and he has not forgotten you. And so if you're like Leah and you feel like no matter what you do, it's just not enough and you are not enough, God is not done. If you're like Tamar and you're facing the pain of broken relationships and broken promises and missed expectations, God is not done. If you're like Rahab, wondering if you'll ever escape from the sins of your past, God is not done. If you're like Ruth, working through the pain of loss in your life and unsure what the future might hold, God is not done. And if you're like Bathsheba and you feel totally alone, like no one could understand what you're going through, like you're completely unseen, God is not done. Friends, if you are at the end of your rope and you feel like you're done and you can't possibly hang on anymore, God is not done. Hang on. Trace his hand in your past. Trust his hand in your present, because if it's not good, God is not done. In our life groups, we're going to look a little bit more at Bathsheba's life, and we're going to talk about this idea. Remember, it's 1,000 years. 1,000 years from Bathsheba's life until the genealogy. But God was at work during those 1,000 years. And he's at work now in your life and in this world. And then next week, we're going to hear about the birth of this baby who's going to do things differently. He's going to embody all the best aspects of the mothers in his lineage, the pursuit for deep intimacy with his loved ones that his mother Leah has, the passion for justice of his mother Tamar, the courage to protect people who need it from his mother Rahab, the tender loyalty of his mother Ruth, the innocence of his mother Bathsheba, and the humility of his mother Mary, who surrenders everything to God's plan for her life and for this world. And he is going to be offered the same opportunity as everyone who came before him to define good for himself, to rule over the land, to reach out and take for himself. But instead of doing what every person before had done, he chose a different path. And in doing so, he changed everything.